Hello and welcome to another edition of the Tigers Down Under. It's been a pretty eventful game, so plenty to talk about. And with me, I have Logan.
Good evening, everybody.
Logan, pretty decent win against Watford in pretty trying circumstances. Obviously, the controversial sending off of Niasse in the 25th minute or 21st minute, something like that. But then to come back and score two goals in the second half was quite a victory.
Decent is certainly the word that you would use to describe the events of Saturday evening our time. I think it's probably, or arguably, the greatest victory we've had this season. Probably the most important as far as the running goes, and the fashion that we did it in was extremely pleasing. If there was any doubt that our form at home was kind of fluky and that we had a couple of favourable home days, I think that we proved everyone wrong on the weekend that we are here to stay and that the KCOM is certainly a fortress, regardless of who visits.
Yeah, I tweeted out to Rick the following day to get the actual stat, and I think the last time we had a red card with scores level in the league game and went on to win the match was back in 2006, I believe, funnily enough, against Southend, who currently are managed by Phil Brown, so there's a bit of a connection there. But it's over 10 years ago that we've managed to have that sort of turnaround. Once we're down and facing it. I think Sagbo's red card against, sorry, not Sagbo, Mbakani's red card against Newcastle in the League Cup this year came close, because he got a red card at 0-0 as well, but obviously just went on to a 1-1 draw in that one. So it's a pretty amazing turnaround in the sense that we're able to come with 10 men and win the match. Which it wouldn't have been possible really without a couple of pretty fantastic saves from Jakupovic in the first half. I think it was an instinctive save from Britos, I'm going to say, and then I think it was in the second half from, it might have been from Capu. So pretty vital saves, I guess, from Jakupovic.
Yeah, Jakupovic has firmed. I think that when Marshall came to the club and there was a lot of contentious talk about who would be the number one keeper, obviously Eldin being a bit of a fan favourite, certainly endeared himself to the fans at the KCOM. There was certainly a lot of credentials for Marshall to be the first choice based on his pedigree and where he'd come from and the form that he'd shown. So I think that just to be able to see Eldin standing up for the running, the fact that the fans are certainly behind him, and he seems to be in probably the form of his career. Like those couple of saves that you mentioned were incredibly vital, and I think that just given the magnitude of what those 3 points meant, it's very easy to look at the two goals and think how much the on-field players did as far as pulling them out when they're obviously down a man, but the fact that Eldin kept us in the game and provided the opportunity for us to pounce and take those two goals. There's a lot to be said for his form and the way he's playing at the moment.
And then, of course, the first goal came about with some lovely counter-attacking football. I actually thought we'd fluffed our lines a little bit. Robertson had the ball and could have played Markovic through when he tore away into space, but he kind of kept his cool and passed it on to Krzyzewski, who put a great ball into the box for Markovic. And it was great to see Markovic get his header against the post or the crossbar, and instead of sort of just assuming it's gone in, he follows up with a great poke to put it in the back of the net to make sure of it. But he really showed some pace and some skill to get that goal and really set us on our way.
Yeah, I don't think there's a greater sight at the KCOM at the moment than Markovic winding up. And as you said, when the break happened, he ran a good 100 metres to put himself into that area. And he just took off. And as you mentioned, I thought the exact same thing when Robertson didn't play him in, that we had fluffed it. And to see the quality of the finish and, as you mentioned, to pick himself up off the ground in the manner he did to follow the tap in, just shows the intensity that he has as a player. And particularly when there was a few short weeks ago, there was criticism about his lack of effort and lack of motivation, particularly tracking back. I think that to see what he offers us in attack and the magnitude of the way that he took that goal, it shows everything about Markovic, and I think that he's certainly answered his critics in a very positive manner.
At this stage, what sort of price tag would you be happy for us to pay to make him a permanent signing? How impressed have you been with him?
It's a very interesting question, and it's a very hard one to answer. And I say that because Markovic, obviously, being left with Sporting Lisbon, it's a very uncommon thing to see people be released from their loan deals. That can only really suggest that either the club's financially struggling or the player is playing well below the form that was expected. So Markovic obviously found his way to Hull City on the back of some pretty dire form. And since he's arrived at the KCOM, and Marco Silva has obviously been able to bring the best out of him, it's a very tough question. I think that in the past, correct me if I'm wrong, Liverpool might have purchased him for around about £20 million.
Yeah, I think it's something like that. So yeah, I mean that's the worries that they'd want to recoup a lot of that.
And that's probably the toughest part about the question. I think that somewhere in the vicinity of 12 to 15 would be a fair price for him, and particularly the form that he started to show in recent weeks. But for a club like ours, are we able to part with that amount of cash, particularly knowing the way that the Allams run the club and the kind of the unknown element to what's going to happen next year? I think that 15 mil would be a fair price tag. Whether we would dish that, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess when I consider the question and I balance out the factors, as you say, what we'd be able to afford and what we'd be willing to pay, if he's able to show this form for the last 4 games of the season and put away another goal or two, I'd probably be inclined to agree and say that he's worth that 10 to 15 million price range. But just on, I mean, the thing for me with him is that he's still incredibly inconsistent, even within games. And when he's on, he's pretty much unstoppable. But if he can play that full 90 minutes more consistently, then he would certainly be up in that bracket. But I think at this stage, yeah, maybe 8 to 10, I think would be the most I'd be willing to spend on him. But I think, yeah, it's looking pretty unlikely that he'll be here next season anyway. So we can enjoy him while we've got him. But the second goal was from a player who'll almost certainly be here next season, and it was from Sam Clucas. And it has to be a pretty impressive strike for the club to revise their goal of the season entries, or their poll for the goal of the season. But it was a lovely strike from Clucas, and based on his comments, saying he'd been waiting for a chance like that all season, fully intended and fully planned.
Yeah, Sam Clucas certainly presents himself as a player who doesn't lack any confidence, and I think that as he's kind of climbed the leagues, it's very obvious to see that he's kind of adapted, and the confidence that he has in his own ability has probably been the biggest draw card to assist him to be able to play at the level he now plays. And as you said, the manner that he took his goal was unbelievable, and it has been a while since we've seen a goal of that type at Hull City. So obviously it was huge on the scale of what it meant for our result, and gave us that second buffer. But to put in a screamer like that, I think it really announced Sam Clucas as the key player, and if not our player of the season, he's certainly there or thereabouts.
The red card thankfully has been overturned, but obviously it was looking quite dire at half time. And I think we were sort of discussing what a best case scenario would be in regards to a result for us and Swansea, as Swansea were leading at the time. But what did you make of it, and what do you make of the fact that it's been overturned?
I think that if there's any justice in the world, I think the fact that the red card was rescinded was exactly what was needed. And look, if we're being honest, I think 99.9% of people at the ground knew that it wasn't a red card. You even could tell in the manner that when Niasse turned around and saw the referee, the shocked face. I know there's been a lot of attention paid to it on social media.
I reckon he was shocked that it was going to be a yellow, so when he saw the red, it was even worse.
That's certainly right. And the other thing that I thought was very noticeable was the Watford players that kind of raced across to pat him on the back as he walked off, as they knew that he was hard done by. So I think that all of those things kind of build the case that Bobby Madley made an absolutely disgusting decision that could have, if the players hadn't have responded in the way they did, potentially put the writing on the wall for a relegation. But thankfully it wasn't to be, and justice has been done, and the FA have finally made a half-decent decision, and seem to have favoured City for perhaps the first time this season.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Silver even it's starting to creep into the things he's saying, that it's happened again for us after the Huddleston one against Everton, obviously, and there's plenty of other decisions we could look at and say that they were pretty ridiculous against us, going all the way back to the opening day when Demarai Gray got a penalty when he was tripped outside the box. But It's happened again, and it happens too often, I think, with clubs, especially lower clubs like ours, where referees can make those decisions and know that even if they get it wrong, it's not going to be in the spotlight for very long, and it's not going to be scrutinised as much as it is if it had happened against, say, a United or Liverpool. Though, funnily enough, he was at the centre of it against United and Chelsea, where Rojo handballed the ball in the lead up to a United goal. So. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, he hasn't been dropped. He's got the Palace Burnley game on the weekend, so I don't know if they're short on refs this weekend or something like that. They've had to ring around to the local clubs, but it's pretty disappointing that a ref can make those sorts of blatantly, obviously poor decisions weeks in a row and still get a gig in the Premier League. And another one's Roger Rees, and he's still running around in the Premier League as well. And they're still criticising decisions he's making and his positioning as a ref and other things like that. So there's a number of them running around in the Premier League who just aren't up to standard.
And I think what the biggest concern about that, as you mentioned, Alex, is Marco Silva being new to the English Premier League. He's obviously just shared about his time in other leagues, and he's obviously been in charge of big clubs and smaller clubs, as we know from his time with S02E29. And for him to come across and start making statements, it's all very well and good for the Tigers fans to feel aggrieved, as any football fan does when a decision doesn't go their way. But when you have kind of that third party, someone who is quite new and unfamiliar with the league, to start making those statements, it's almost plain Jane. It's obvious for everyone, and it's a huge concern that we see that trend continually reoccurring, and nothing really seems to be done. And as you mentioned, the fact that these referees are still running around, there's obviously no accountability.
Absolutely. Do you think that 11 that took the field or started the game for us is basically our best 11? I mean, obviously Hernandez is the obvious one on the bench. Huddleston, another one who could force their way into the team and maybe get a start on the weekend against Southampton. But that 11 that was picked almost seems to be our go-to starting 11 now.
Yeah, I think so. But I also struggle to find a place for Evandro in the starting 11, particularly at home. I think that Hernandez and Niasse up top is obviously our best setup as far as when we attack teams. I do like seeing Evandro come on later in the game and kind of take a little bit more control of the midfield and kind of slow the play up, because Evandro is very good with the ball at his feet and seems to have a little bit of composure. So I don't mind seeing that change later when we're locking up games, but I probably wouldn't start Evandro. He's the one person out of the mix that wouldn't find his way in. And also when Abdullahi, whether he plays or El Mohammadi plays, is probably the other one that we would take some revising.
Well, one player who hasn't found his way into the starting 11 since the start of the season, but is our player of the week, is Adama Diomande, who arrived under pretty good reputation at the start of last season, having bagged, I think it was 17 goals in 21 games or something like that in Norway. And the comments at the time were that players coming from Norway actually tended to adapt pretty well to the English game. It wasn't necessarily going to be the case with him having suffered an injury. I'm pretty sure it was actually just before he arrived with us, and which meant that he was basically out until December of that debut season. But he sort of worked his way into the team in the championship, and he scored a couple of goals for us, which was great to see. And then he's scored, I think, only 2 goals in the Premier League this season, but both of them are up for goal of the season, being his bicycle kick on the opening day shared with Hernandez, and then a pretty beautiful goal against Crystal Palace with that lovely turn and shot across the goal. So he's kind of shown glimpses of a bit of talent, but sadly I tend to suspect that he'll be on his way out at the end of this season. But what have you made of his time at City?
Yeah, he's a strange one. I think that when he's called upon to put in a shift, I think his work rate is incredible for a player who is predominantly recognised for his attacking ability, and I think that's a huge thing, particularly when you're facing a relegation scrap, to have players with that kind of intensity and work rate. I think that he does suit the City fold in many ways. As you mentioned, he's probably not the most clinical of players, but then he does pull out these spectacular goals and moments of individual brilliance that you kind of don't know where it came from. It's a strange one because of the time that he has spent on paper in the black and amber, and it still kind of feels like we haven't seen all that much of him. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic that he has played for so long and he's still a relatively unknown entity. I would have to agree. I think that if City do stay up, as we are all hoping that they do, I think that he would be deemed excess to the cause, and I think they'd probably get rid of him and opt for a different option. However, if he does manage to, or if we do manage to not stay up, rather, I think that it's a very high likelihood that he will be seen as a viable option to continue his time at Hull in the Championship.
Well, I guess that's a fair point, because if we do get relegated, I suspect Hernandez will be out the door, and obviously Niasse will go back to Everton. Diomande would be our only senior striker on the books, so there would likely be a chance that he would stay in the Championship. So yeah, no, that would be interesting. I mean, he seems to be the latest in the line of, the last in the line, I should say, of Steve Bruce signings of foreign strikers, where he's not necessarily seen a whole lot of them. I mean, we had Proschwitz, we had Sagbo, and we had Diomande, I guess, as the other one, where they sort of came into the club sort of out of nowhere, and no one really knew a whole lot about them, and didn't really set the league on fire. But if he's able to find his feet next season, if he does stick around, it'd be good to see. As you say, it feels like we haven't seen a whole lot of him. He seemed to start the season pretty well, scored 2 goals in the League Cup as well, and he seemed pretty willing to work as a wide player as well, so he seems pretty flexible and good for formation changes, but his first touch has sort of let him down at times, and he does seem to kind of have very patchy form. He's a bit like Niasse, but without that predatory instinct around goal that Niasse has shown at home at least. But yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Which of his 2 goals from this season in the Premier League do you prefer?
I think the double bicycle. I don't think you'll see many goals like that very often at all. And I think that because of the nature of it being the first goal of the Premier League season and the day that we opened the season with hardly any men and ended up beating the champions, I think that would be the one that stands out of the 2.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got to agree with that. I think, I don't think you'll ever see a goal like that again. It's just such a remarkable circumstance to have a coordinated bicycle kick of that sort, and not have it sort of stuff up the ball movement by having 2 players kicking at the ball. But it was certainly remarkable to see. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with him. But we'll move on now, and we'll preview the upcoming game against Southampton. It's away at St Mary's, where we haven't had the best of records. I don't think we've won there in the league since the 50s. I think it's 1951 was our last win there. But of course, we beat them earlier in the season when we were playing absolutely terribly. So at least in some sense, that bodes well that the team should be able to draw some confidence from the way we played against them early in the season. And of course, they've just had a midweek tonking at Chelsea where they lost 4-2. So hopefully, confidence low for Southampton, confidence high for us, knowing this is basically our last big chance to get away points. I think travelling to Palace is looking increasingly difficult. How do you see the game going?
But it's Hull City away at the moment is an incredibly difficult prediction to make, and I think the question is, will the away run form? It has to end. We're on the final stretch now. I think that it's an alarming concern for all the players as well. They know that probably the win against Sunderland won't be enough or just enough to get us over the line. Granted, it may be, given Swansea's results. However, I think that it's become pretty clear that if we're not to take anything on the road, there's a very high chance that we won't survive, or worse, we'll have to turn Tottenham over on the final day. So I do hold more hope of us getting a result at St Mary's than I do at Selhurst Park, as you mentioned. Whether it's a point or 3 points, I'm not so sure. I think that a draw this weekend would be a huge result for us, and I can see it being a low-scoring affair. I can actually maybe go with a 1-1. I think it'll be a kind of open game, similar to what we saw at Stoke.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think even if we only get a draw at St Mary's, I think that's almost enough. Obviously, going on the assumption that Swansea lose to both Everton and United. I mean, if they were to pick up a point or 3 points against either or both of those sides, it ends up being quite difficult for us to stay up, even if we were to get something against Southampton, purely because of our tough games coming in the run in. Yeah, it's going to be very tough. I think our away form has been pretty poor, and it's hard to be too optimistic or too positive about a result here. But you know, small things to cling on to are, as I mentioned, the fact that they've had that midweek game. We're fully rested, so hopefully we've had all week to focus on the game and really be up for it. And hopefully the players know, as you say, this is sort of our last big chance. I guess Palace is the other one, but unless we're relying on getting a result against Spurs, it's really looking like we have to pick up something away from home to be in with a chance of staying up. I didn't ask you before about it, but what do you make of Swansea's win over Stoke? Do you sort of see that as them getting back on track, or is that sort of more a blip rather than anything?
I somewhat expected it. I thought that in front of their home fans and the criticism that they were under, I knew that Stoke haven't travelled too well this season either, and I think Swansea knew certainly that was they were playing for their season, and then they obviously lifted. I thought that the second goal, whilst they did win, it wasn't by any means a convincing victory, and even though the scoreline ended 2-0. The second goal was extremely lucky, and I think you mentioned to me as well. Arnautovic missed the penalty as well. He skied it. So, fortune changes, and that game could have very easily been 1-1, but it was obviously a day where things went right for Swansea, and I think that just on that as well, I think that their game against United will end up being quite a crucial one. Particularly with the form United are in at the moment, if they're able to turn them over and put a score on Swansea, I think not only will it be deflating, but it gives us that goal difference edge as well, pending the result for us at St Mary's this weekend as well.
Well, it's going to be an interesting feeling. We haven't. It's been a while since Swansea and Hull were playing at different times, and we've been able to sort of sit back and watch their game. So certainly, I mean, if we were able to spring an upset and get the 3 points at St Mary's, it would be a great position to be in, being 5 points up on them come Sunday night to watch their game. Of course, even if we weren't to win, still being 2 points up, it would be great to sit back and watch because the pressure's still on them to get those points and to get above us. And I think Clement or someone mentioned, probably not Clement, but someone would have mentioned just how deflating it would be for the Swansea players to be in at half time 1-0 up and see that our score was 0-0 with us having a red card, and then to come in at full time and say that we'd got up 2-0. It'd be terribly deflating for the players to think that they've put that effort in, they've turned it around. I think it was their first win since February, and they're still in the relegation zone. They're still 2 points below us. So I tend to get the feeling that it won't go down to the final weekend just because. I think if we're able to get the points against Sunderland to go 5 points ahead of them, assuming they lose to United and Everton, 5 points with 2 games to play, that means we really just need to pick up 1 point to almost mathematically seal it, barring goal difference. But look, I mean, unless they were to win those last 2 games against, I think it's Sunderland and West Brom, they'd have to win both of those, which they may well do, but yeah, I guess I'm being more optimistic than anything that if it does go to the final weekend, I don't think we're going to stand too much chance against Spurs.
And I do think that Sunderland will play that game against Swansea at the Stadium of Light as their grand final in many ways, because obviously with the relegation looming, that is almost a certainty after this morning. I think that they will treat that game as the kind of farewell to the fans and give them, or hope to give them back something for their efforts this year.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw it the last time we were relegated when we were playing Burnley, and I think Burnley were already down, or I think it might have been confirmed during the game, and they came out and they just had no fear. They had nothing holding them back, and suddenly they were able to play much more confident football and they beat us because we were much more timid and aware that if we lost that game, we were really facing an uphill battle to get back into it. So I suspect, I mean, if Sunderland are already down, as they likely will be, and Swansea sort of have to win that game, as I'm saying, I mean, if we beat Sunderland the week before, all of a sudden that's a 5 point gap for them. They have to win that game. You know, funny things can happen in football, and we saw Middlesbrough this morning beat Sunderland when they're virtually down as well. So teams can sort of play a bit better when the pressure's off them, and who knows what the result will be. But it'll be a very interesting run-in of games, and it starts at St Mary's this weekend, where you're going with a 1-1 or a 1-0 result. I suspect the same. I think it could be 1-1, or maybe one of the teams edging at 2-1. But hopefully it's City in that case. In terms of the lineup, do you see Hernandez starting the game, or do you think we go with Niasse again?
Uh, I think that Hernandez will probably start from the bench. I can't see him starting. I think Niasse will be the lone striker. They'll set up and be harder to break down, and then depending on what the game looks like later on, then Marco Silva will look to release Hernandez into the fold late in the piece. But I do figure that if we are in a good position to take a point, there's a very good chance that he may settle for a point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a point would be a great result in this game, and it really would edge us a bit clearer of the relegation zone. And of course, there's a fair few teams only about a win ahead of us. So even if we were just to get a point, that suddenly brings them all back into it as well. So Burnley would certainly be looking over their shoulders, for instance, as one team. But there's a number of them. So it'll certainly be an interesting run-in, and we've got it all to look forward to. So thanks very much for joining me, Logan.
Not a problem.
And thanks everyone for listening in. Hopefully we can get the positive result against Southampton and make that safety push a little bit more secure. So until next time, come on City! You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group, or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
There's no turning back 'cause you're out.